There are many ways you could have been exposed to asbestos. Maybe you worked in construction decades ago. Maybe you served in the Navy. Maybe you discovered asbestos in your home. Whatever the source, today you know how dangerous that exposure could have been, and you're wondering whether you should get checked, when and whether you should worry, and what symptoms mean it's time to see a doctor. The challenge is that asbestos-related diseases don't appear until decades after exposure, and unnecessary testing has its own risks and costs. Today, I want to give you clear guidance about when to get checked after asbestos exposure. I'm Terry Oppenheimer. I've been writing about mesothelioma and asbestos for the website mesothelioma.net for over a decade. I'm not a physician, and this is not medical advice. But understanding when screening makes sense could save your life through early detection. Let's start with the fundamental timeline of asbestos-related diseases. Mesothelioma's latency period, which is the time from exposure to when disease develops, is typically 20 to 50 years, with an average of around 30 to 40 years. This means if you were exposed to asbestos in 1985, you wouldn't expect to see mesothelioma symptoms until 2015 or later. This long latency creates a dilemma. If you were exposed to asbestos 5 years ago, getting screening tests now is unlikely to find anything because not enough time has passed for the disease to develop. But if you wait 30 years until symptoms appear, it'll be too late for early detection. So when should you get checked? The answer depends on several factors: the extent and duration of your exposure, how long ago the exposure occurred, your age, whether you're having any symptoms, and your overall risk profile. For people with heavy occupational exposure, if you worked as an insulator or shipyard worker or in any other high-risk occupation for years or decades, you should consider beginning periodic screening around age 50 or about 20 to 30 years after your exposure ended, whichever comes first. This is when high-risk individuals most frequently begin to be diagnosed and where screening might find early disease. Now, I'm going to take a quick break here to ask you a favor. If you find these videos helpful, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. It makes it easier for other people who need this information to find us. Also, if you have questions or there's a topic you'd like to see addressed in a future video, send me a note in the comment section. And make sure you watch until the end, because I'm going to give you valuable information on where to find resources that will make a real difference for you. Now, for people with moderate occupational exposure, if you worked in construction or industrial settings where asbestos was present, but it wasn't a material that you worked with directly or primarily, you might want to start discussing screening with your doctor, but not until around age 55 to 60, or let's say 25 to 30 years after exposure. Your risk is lower than is true for those with heavy exposure, but it's still above the baseline level. For people with brief or low-level exposure, if you worked on a one-time renovation project, you lived in a building with asbestos but had limited exposure to the material, then routine screening probably not warranted unless you develop symptoms. Your risk is much lower, and the likelihood of finding disease through screening, it's low enough that the costs and risks of screening outweigh the benefits. What does screening involve? The most useful screening tool for asbestos-related disease is a chest CT scan. CT stands for computed tomography. CT scans are much more sensitive than chest x-rays for detecting early pleural changes like thickening, small effusions, or early masses. Low-dose CT scans, like those used for lung cancer screening, they may be appropriate for people who have both asbestos exposure and a history of smoking. These scans screen for lung cancer and other asbestos-related diseases. If you have heavy asbestos exposure and you smoked, you absolutely should discuss lung cancer screening with your doctor. How often should screening occur? There's no definitive answer because mesothelioma is too rare for large screening trials. Some experts suggest annual or biennial CT scans for high-risk individuals, while others suggest limiting it to every 2 to 3 years. This is a conversation you should have with your doctor, and the answer should be based on your specific risk profile. Chest x-rays are cheaper and they involve less radiation than CT scans, but they're also much less sensitive for early mesothelioma. Pleural thickening and small effusions can be missed, so if you're going to screen, CT is the appropriate test. Blood biomarker tests like Mesomark are not appropriate for screening asymptomatic people. As I've discussed in other videos, these tests have too many false negatives and false positives to be useful screening tools. They have a role in monitoring patients who've already been diagnosed with mesothelioma, but not in screening. Now, let's talk about symptoms and when having symptoms means you need to get checked immediately, regardless of how long ago your exposure occurred. The key warning signs for pleural mesothelioma are shortness of breath that gets worse over weeks or months, a persistent dry cough that doesn't respond to usual treatments and doesn't go away, and unexplained chest pain, especially if the pain worsens with deep breathing. For peritoneal mesothelioma, the warning signs are progressive abdominal swelling or bloating, persistent abdominal pain or discomfort, unexplained changes in your bowel habits, and feeling full quickly when eating. If you have any of these symptoms and you have a history of asbestos exposure, you need to see a doctor as soon as possible, and you need to explicitly mention your asbestos exposure. Don't assume that these symptoms are nothing. And more importantly, don't let your doctor do it. Don't let them dismiss your symptoms without proper investigation. You need to be your own best advocate. When you tell your doctor about your symptoms, make sure that you emphasize your exposure history. Say something like, I worked as a pipe fitter for 30 years and was heavily exposed to asbestos. Now I'm having progressive shortness of breath and I'm concerned it could be mesothelioma. This direct, straightforward communication ensures that your doctor will include mesothelioma in your differential diagnosis, will take your symptoms seriously, and will order appropriate testing. Now, the tests your doctor should order if you have symptoms and a history of exposure. For respiratory symptoms, again, you should have a chest CT scan, not just an X-ray. You should have pulmonary function tests that measure your lung capacity and function. And if your CT scan shows abnormalities, you might need to be referred to either pulmonology or thoracic surgery or both for further evaluation. For abdominal symptoms, you need an abdominal CT scan. And if fluid is present, you might need another test called a paracentesis that analyzes the fluid. Don't accept the X-ray looks fine if you're having progressive symptoms and you have an exposure history. Insist on a CT scan, which is much more sensitive. Now, what about genetic testing? There are some people who find that if they have a BAP1 mutation, their mesothelioma responds better to treatment, but that doesn't mean that it's a good screening test. Having a genetic variant like that isn't something that warrants screening. What should you not do? Don't try to get screening CT scans every few months or even every year if you've only had brief, low-level exposure decades ago. The radiation exposure from repeated CT scans carries its own small cancer risk. And in your case, the likelihood of finding early mesothelioma is very low. The precaution of screening needs to be balanced against the risks and the costs. So Don't obsess over every minor symptom. If you sneeze twice, it doesn't mean you have mesothelioma. The symptoms that matter are persistent and progressive. They don't go away, and they get worse over time. By the same token, don't avoid medical care or tests out of fear of what you might find. Early detection of mesothelioma allows you to arrange for more treatment, better outcomes. Catching it at stage 1 or 2 is dramatically better than waiting until you're critically ill. Documentation is important. If you're in a high-risk occupation or you know you had significant exposure, document your work history in detail while you still remember it. Record where you worked, what years, what your job duties were, and what products you used. Keep this information with your medical records. If you develop an asbestos-related disease 30 years from now, this documentation will be important for both medical care and supporting any legal claims you might pursue. So, to review, when should you get checked after asbestos exposure? For heavy occupational exposure, consider screening with CT scans starting around age 50 or 20 to 30 years after exposure. For moderate exposure, discuss with your doctor around age 55 to 60. For brief exposure, screening isn't needed unless you develop symptoms. So, if you have progressive shortness of breath, persistent cough, chest pain, or abdominal symptoms and an exposure history, see a doctor immediately and mention your asbestos exposure explicitly. Early detection improves outcomes. Visit mesothelioma.net for information about screening, symptoms, and where to find the best places for treatment. If you want to speak to somebody right away, you can call 1-800-692-8608 to speak directly to one of our patient advocates, or you can use the live chat feature on the website. As for me, remember to post your questions below, and I'll see you next time.